In the summer of 1911, a 10-year-old girl's laughter echoed through the peaceful village of Longros, England. By nightfall, that same child would be found dead in a shallow pond, her skull fractured by multiple brutal blows. The case of Amy Margaret Reeves would become one of Victorian England's most disturbing unsolved murders. A crime so shocking that it continues to haunt investigators and historians more than a century later. What happened on that fateful July afternoon remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in British criminal history. A young girl playing innocently in her family's yard would vanish without a trace, only to be discovered hours later as the victim of a savage attack. The evidence would point to a teenage neighbor, yet justice would remain forever elusive, leaving behind more questions than answers. This is not just another cold case from the archives of history. This is a story that reveals the dark underbelly of Edwardian society, where children were vulnerable to predators hiding in plain sight, and where the primitive investigative methods of the early 20th century failed to deliver justice for the innocent. The brutal murder of Amy Reeves exposes the chilling reality that some monsters walk among us, leaving devastation in their wake while escaping accountability. Today, we delve into the terrifying events of July 18, 1911, examining every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, and every failed attempt to solve this heinous crime. We'll explore how a simple afternoon of play transformed into a nightmare that would forever scar a small English village and leave a family destroyed by unimaginable loss. The story of Amy Reeves is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a stark reminder that evil has no boundaries, that innocence offers no protection, and that sometimes the most horrifying crimes are committed by those we least suspect. As we uncover the dark truth behind this century-old mystery, prepare yourself for a journey into one of the most disturbing chapters of British criminal history. But be warned, the details of this case are not for the faint of heart. The violence inflicted upon a defenseless child, the incompetence of early forensic science, and the ultimate failure of the justice system combined to create a narrative that will stay with you long after this video ends. This is the horrifying case of Amy Margaret Reeves, a crime that time has failed to heal. The year 1911 marked the height of the Edwardian era, a time when King Edward II's reign had given way to his son George V. Britain stood at the crossroads between Victorian tradition and modern innovation. Society was rapidly changing, with new technologies emerging and old social structures beginning to crumble. Yet in rural villages like Longros, life moved at the same peaceful pace it had for generations. Longros was a small hamlet in Surrey, nestled in the English countryside where everyone knew their neighbours and children played freely without fear. The community was tight-knit, built around agricultural work and simple living, where families had resided for decades, and trust was implicit among residents. It was the kind of place where doors remained unlocked, and children wandered freely, their safety assured by the watchful eyes of the entire village. The social hierarchy of Edwardian England was still firmly in place, with clear distinctions between classes and occupations. Working families like the Reeves lived modestly, with fathers labouring as gardeners, farmhands, or tradesmen, while their children helped with household chores and attended the local school. Crime, particularly violent crime against children, was virtually unheard of in such communities, making what happened to Amy Reeves all the more shocking. Child labour laws were still in their infancy in 1911, and it was common for teenagers like Albert Hampton to work full-time as gardeners or farmhands. These young workers often lived with or near their employers, becoming familiar faces in the community, despite their transient nature. The blurred lines between childhood and adulthood meant that teenage workers were trusted with adult responsibilities, yet their psychological development remained incomplete. The investigative methods available to police in 1911 were primitive by today's standards. Fingerprinting was still a relatively new science. DNA analysis was decades away, and forensic pathology was in its infancy. Investigators relied primarily on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and basic physical examination of crime scenes. This lack of sophisticated investigative tools would prove crucial in the failure to solve Amy's murder. The legal system of the time required a much higher burden of proof for conviction, particularly in capital cases. Without modern forensic evidence, prosecutors relied heavily on confessions and eyewitness accounts, circumstantial evidence that could establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The primitive state of criminal investigation meant that many cases that might be solved today remained mysteries, leaving families without closure and perpetrators free to potentially strike again. The broader context of Edwardian society also reveals troubling attitudes toward children and their testimony. Young witnesses were often dismissed or considered unreliable. While the concept of psychological trauma was poorly understood, this societal blindness to children's vulnerability would play a significant role in how Amy's case was handled, contributing to the ultimate failure of justice in her murder. Amy Margaret Reeves was born on November 27, 1900, into a working-class family that called the cottage at Kitsme their home. Her father worked as a gardener, a respectable occupation that provided a modest but steady income for the family. The Reeves family had lived in Longros for years, establishing themselves as reliable, hard-working members of the small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. At 10 years old, Amy was described as a bright, cheerful child who enjoyed playing outdoors and helping her mother with household tasks. Like most children of her era, she had responsibilities around the home, but also enjoyed the freedom to play in the family's yard and explore the nearby countryside. Her innocent nature and trusting disposition made her beloved by neighbors, but also tragically vulnerable to those who might wish her harm. The morning of July 18, 1911, began like any other for the Reeves family. Amy's father left for work at the unusually early hour of 3:45 a.m., a common practice for gardeners who sought to complete their outdoor labor before the heat of the day became unbearable. When he departed, Amy was sound asleep in her bed, safe and secure in the family cottage that had been her home for her entire short life. Amy spent the morning helping her mother with various household chores, a typical routine for children of working families. Around 11 o'clock a.m., witnesses observed her playing in the yard with Albert Hampton, a 16-year-old neighbor who worked as a gardener and was a frequent visitor to the area. The interaction appeared normal and playful, with no indication of the violence that would soon follow. At noon, Amy came inside briefly to help herself to some bread and butter, before returning to play in the yard. Her mother last saw her at 12:30 in the afternoon playing alone in the family's yard, seemingly content and safe in the familiar surroundings of her home. This would be the final time anyone would see Amy Margaret Reeves alive, a fact that would haunt her family and the entire community for generations to come. Between 2 and 2:30 in the afternoon that day, a neighbor noticed Albert Hampton walking up the garden path, appearing somewhat flustered and agitated. When questioned about his demeanor, he claimed to have been sleeping under an apple tree, but his nervous behavior and evasive answers would later raise suspicions among investigators. This encounter would become a crucial piece of evidence in the subsequent investigation. As evening approached and Amy failed to return home, her father's concern grew into panic. The close-knit community immediately mobilized to search for the missing child. With neighbors and local residents combing the area around the family cottage, the search would end in the most horrific discovery imaginable, forever shattering the peace of the small village and destroying a family's world. The search for Amy Reeves began as the sun started to set on July 18, 1911, when her father returned from work to find his daughter missing. In a small community like Longros, a child's unexplained absence was cause for immediate concern, as everyone knew everyone else's routines and movements. The father's growing panic was shared by neighbors who joined the search, combing the familiar paths and hiding places where a child might wander. As darkness fell and Amy remained missing, the search took on a more urgent and systematic approach. Local residents organized into groups, checking out buildings, wells, and any location where a child might have become trapped or injured. The peaceful village transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, as worried voices called Amy's name through the gathering darkness, hoping for a response that would never come. It was Amy's own father who made the horrific discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Following a footpath that led away from their cottage, he arrived at a small round pond on Churchy Common, approximately 200 yards from their home. The pond was unremarkable, about 11 feet across, and averaging only 9 inches of water depth, with another 9 inches of mud at the bottom. What he saw in that shallow water would be forever burned into his memory. Amy's small body lay face down in the pond, with only her bare feet visible above the surface. The sight of his beloved daughter's lifeless form in the murky water represented every parent's worst nightmare made horrifyingly real. The father's anguished cries for help brought other searchers running to the scene of the tragedy. The immediate examination of Amy's body revealed the brutal nature of her death. She had sustained multiple severe head injuries, each wound appearing to penetrate to the bone with devastating force. The violence inflicted upon the small child was shocking in its intensity, suggesting a level of rage or desperation that seemed incomprehensible in the peaceful rural setting where such horrors were unthinkable. Standing upright in the center of the pond was a thick wooden stick protruding about 2 inches above the water's surface. This makeshift weapon, embedded in the mud and water, represented the instrument of Amy's destruction and would become crucial evidence in the investigation that followed. The presence of the stick suggested that the attack had occurred while Amy was already in or near the water. The scene that greeted the arriving police inspector was one of almost unimaginable horror. A child's life had been brutally ended in a location that should have been safe, using a weapon that transformed an innocent afternoon into a nightmare. The investigation that would follow would reveal the limitations of early 20th century criminal investigation and the tragic consequences of a justice system unprepared for such calculating evil. Police inspector arrived at the scene in the early morning hours of July 19, 1911, to begin what would become one of the most challenging investigations in the area's history. The crime scene presented a complex puzzle with limited forensic tools available to solve it. The inspector's examination of Amy's body revealed 3 distinct wounds on her head, one on top, one above the right eyebrow, and one at the base of her skull, each appearing to have been inflicted with tremendous force. The thick stick found standing in the pond matched the description of a weapon that witnesses had seen Albert Hampton carrying earlier that day. The wooden club had been driven deep into the mud at the bottom of the pond, suggesting it had been used with considerable force before being left at the scene. The positioning of the weapon indicated that the attack had occurred while Amy was standing in or very near the shallow water. A Home Office professor who examined the evidence concluded that Amy had been struck on the head with the stick while standing in the pond, causing her to fall forward and drown in the shallow water. The combination of blunt force trauma and drowning suggested a particularly brutal and prolonged attack, as the perpetrator had continued the assault even after Amy had fallen into the water and was likely unconscious or dying. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the final moments of Amy's life. The multiple head wounds indicated that she had been struck repeatedly with tremendous force, suggesting either extreme rage or a calculated effort to ensure her death. The fact that she was found face down in the water confirmed that she had drowned after being incapacitated by the head trauma, adding a layer of cruelty to an already horrific crime. Witness testimony placed Albert Hampton in the vicinity of the crime scene around the time of Amy's disappearance, and multiple residents had observed him carrying a thick stick similar to the murder weapon. His nervous behavior when questioned, combined with his proximity to the victim and possession of a potential weapon, made him the primary suspect in the investigation. However, the circumstantial nature of the evidence would prove problematic for prosecutors. The primitive forensic capabilities of 1911 meant that investigators could not determine definitive proof linking Hampton to the crime. Without fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, or advanced pathological examination techniques, the case relied entirely on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. The thick stick, while similar to the one Hampton had been carrying, could not be definitively linked to him through scientific analysis. The investigation also revealed troubling gaps in Hampton's alibi for the crucial time period when Amy disappeared. His claim of sleeping under an apple tree could not be independently verified, and his agitated behavior when questioned by neighbors raised additional suspicions. However, the lack of direct evidence meant that investigators could not build a case strong enough to guarantee conviction in court. Albert Hampton was a 16-year-old gardener who lived and worked in the Longcross area, making him a familiar figure in the small community. Despite his youth, he was employed full-time and was often seen moving between various properties where his gardening services were needed. His presence in the neighborhood was so common that residents barely noticed his comings and goings, making him an almost invisible figure in the daily life of the village. Witnesses who testified at the subsequent inquest painted a picture of Hampton as a somewhat troubled young man whose behavior on July 18th was notably different from his usual demeanor. Several residents observed him carrying a thick wooden stick throughout the morning and early afternoon, using it as he moved between work locations. This stick would later become central to the investigation when a similar weapon was found at the murder scene. The testimony of Amy's mother proved particularly damaging to Hampton's case. She testified that she had seen Hampton and Amy playing together in the yard between 11 a.m. and noon on the day of the murder, establishing that he had recent contact with the victim. Her observation that the two children appeared to be engaged in normal play provided no indication of the violence that would follow just hours later. A crucial witness testified about encountering Hampton between 2 and 2:30 p.m., describing him as appearing flurried and nervous, as though he wanted to speak, but didn't know what to say. When questioned about his activities, Hampton claimed he had been sleeping under an apple tree, but his agitated state and evasive answers suggested otherwise. This encounter occurred during the critical time period when Amy's disappearance would have been discovered. Hampton's behavior during police questioning revealed a pattern of lies and contradictions that further implicated him in the crime. Initially, he provided what appeared to be a straightforward account of his activities, but as investigators pressed for details, his story began to change and contradict earlier statements. His inability to provide a verifiable alibi for the crucial time period made him the prime suspect in Amy's murder. The circumstantial evidence against Hampton continued to mount as the investigation progressed. Multiple witnesses had seen him with a weapon similar to the murder weapon. He had recent contact with the victim. His behavior after the crime was suspicious, and he could not account for his whereabouts during the critical time period. For investigators working with 1911 technology and methods, this combination of evidence seemed to point clearly to Hampton as the perpetrator. However, Hampton maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, insisting that he had no involvement in Amy's death. His youth and the lack of any apparent motive complicated the case, as investigators struggled to understand why a 16-year-old would commit such a brutal murder against a child he had been seen playing with just hours earlier. The absence of a clear motive would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. The arrest of Albert Hampton sent shock waves through the small community of Longcross, where violent crime was virtually unknown, and the idea that a local teenager could commit such a brutal murder seemed incomprehensible. Residents who had known Hampton as a quiet, hard-working young man struggled to reconcile his familiar presence with the horrific crime that had shattered their peaceful village. The arrest divided the community between those who believed in his guilt and others who couldn't accept that someone they knew could be capable of such evil. The legal proceedings that followed highlighted the primitive state of criminal investigation and prosecution in early 20th century England. Without modern forensic evidence, the case against Hampton rested entirely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, creating significant challenges for prosecutors attempting to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The burden of proof required for capital crimes was substantial, and the evidence, while suggestive, fell short of the definitive proof needed for conviction. The inquest into Amy's death became a focal point for the community's grief and desire for justice. Local residents packed the courthouse, seeking answers and closure for a crime that had destroyed their sense of security and innocence. The proceedings revealed the full horror of Amy's final moments, while also exposing the limitations of the investigative methods available to solve such complex crimes. Witness after witness testified about Hampton's suspicious behavior, his possession of a weapon similar to the murder weapon, and his inability to provide a credible alibi for the time of the murder. The cumulative weight of the circumstantial evidence painted a compelling picture of guilt, yet it remained just that, circumstantial. The lack of direct evidence or confession meant that reasonable doubt remained, despite the strong suspicion surrounding Hampton's involvement. The defense argued that the evidence against Hampton was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the case and the lack of clear motive for such a brutal crime. They pointed out that many people in the community had access to similar sticks, and that Hampton's nervous behavior could be explained by the stress of being questioned about a serious crime rather than guilt. The jury's deliberation reflected the difficulty of the case and the limitations of the evidence available. While many jurors were convinced of Hampton's guilt based on the circumstantial evidence, others harbored doubts about convicting a young man on such limited proof. The weight of potentially sending a 16-year-old to the gallows based on circumstantial evidence proved too heavy for the jury to bear. On August 11, 1911, the jury returned a verdict that would forever seal Amy's case as an unsolved mystery. They found that Amy Margaret Reeves had been the victim of willful murder, but declared there was insufficient evidence to determine by whom it was committed. Albert Hampton was released from custody, but the cloud of suspicion would follow him for the rest of his life, while Amy's family was left without justice or closure. The immediate aftermath of Albert Hampton's release created an atmosphere of tension and unease in Long Cross that would persist for years to come. While Hampton was legally free, the community remained divided about his innocence or guilt, with many residents believing that a murderer had escaped justice due to the inadequacies of the legal system. The young man found himself ostracized by many in the community, forced to live under a permanent cloud of suspicion that would follow him wherever he went. Amy's family was devastated by the jury's verdict, which left them without the closure that a conviction might have provided. The failure of the justice system to definitively solve their daughter's murder meant that they would never know with certainty who had taken Amy's life, or why such a horrific crime had been committed. The uncertainty was almost as painful as the loss itself, creating a wound that would never properly heal. The case exposed significant flaws in the early 20th century criminal justice system, particularly the limitations of investigative techniques and forensic science. The inability to definitively link physical evidence to suspects meant that many cases that might be solved today remained mysteries, leaving families without justice and potentially dangerous individuals free to commit additional crimes. Amy's case became a stark example of how primitive investigative methods could fail victims and their families. The broader impact on the community of Long Ross was profound and lasting. The brutal murder of a child shattered the village's sense of security and innocence, introducing a level of fear and suspicion that had never existed before. Parents became more protective of their children. Neighbors viewed each other with new suspicion, and the simple trust that had characterized rural English life began to erode. Local law enforcement agencies used the Amy Reeves case as a learning experience, recognizing the need for improved investigative techniques and better coordination between different jurisdictions. The case highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes, collecting physical evidence systematically, and developing more sophisticated methods for linking suspects to crimes. These lessons would gradually be incorporated into police training and procedures. Over the following decades, the media coverage of the case, while limited by 1911 standards, brought national attention to the murder and the subsequent investigation. Newspapers across England reported on the horrific crime and the failure to achieve a conviction, contributing to growing public awareness of the limitations of the criminal justice system. The case became a symbol of the need for reform and modernization in law enforcement practices. The psychological impact on the investigators who worked the case was also significant. Police officers and legal professionals who had devoted months to building a case against Hampton, experienced frustration and disappointment when their efforts failed to achieve justice for Amy. The case served as a reminder of the imperfect nature of the justice system and the reality that not all crimes could be solved with the tools and methods available at the time. The legacy of Amy Margaret Reeves extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of her death, serving as a catalyst for significant changes in criminal investigation procedures and child protection policies throughout England. Her case became a rallying point for reformers who argued for more sophisticated police training, better crime scene preservation techniques, and improved forensic capabilities that might prevent future failures of justice. In the decades following Amy's murder, British law enforcement agencies gradually adopted more scientific approaches to criminal investigation, influenced in part by high-profile unsolved cases like hers that demonstrated the limitations of traditional methods. The development of fingerprinting, improved photographic documentation of crime scenes, and more systematic approaches to witness interviews all emerged from recognition that the old ways of investigating crime were inadequate for the challenges of the modern world. The case also contributed to growing awareness of children's vulnerability to violence and the need for better protection mechanisms within communities. Amy's death highlighted how easily a child could become the victim of a predator, even in what appeared to be the safest of environments. This awareness led to gradual changes in how communities approach child safety and supervision. Though progress was slow and uneven, modern criminal investigators and forensic experts who study the Amy Reeves case often point to it as an example of how different the outcome might have been with contemporary investigative techniques. DNA analysis of evidence from the crime scene, advanced pathological examination of the victim's injuries, and sophisticated psychological profiling of suspects might have provided the definitive proof needed to solve the case and achieve justice for Amy. The unsolved nature of Amy's murder continues to fascinate true crime researchers and amateur investigators who periodically review the case files and evidence in hopes of finding new insights or overlooked clues. These modern examinations, while unable to definitively solve the century-old mystery, have contributed to ongoing discussions about the evolution of criminal investigation and the importance of preserving historical case files for future analysis. The story of Amy Reeves has been preserved in local historical records and crime archives, ensuring that her memory and the lessons of her case continue to inform discussions about justice, investigation, and child protection. Museums and historical societies in the Surrey area maintain exhibits and documentation related to the case, recognizing its significance in the development of modern criminal investigation techniques. Educational institutions that train law enforcement professionals often use historical cases like Amy's to illustrate the evolution of investigative methods and the importance of scientific approaches to crime solving. Her case serves as a powerful reminder of how far criminal investigation has progressed and the ongoing need for continued advancement in forensic science and investigative techniques. As we reach the end of this horrifying journey through one of Victorian England's most disturbing unsolved murders, we are left with more questions than answers about the brutal death of 10-year-old Amy Margaret Reeves. The case represents a perfect storm of primitive investigative techniques, insufficient evidence, and a justice system unprepared to deal with such calculated evil hidden within a seemingly innocent community. The failure to achieve justice for Amy reflects the broader limitations of early 20th century criminal investigation. Yet, it also serves as a powerful reminder of how far we have come in our ability to solve complex crimes and protect the innocent. Modern forensic science, sophisticated investigative techniques, and improved understanding of criminal psychology might have provided the answers that eluded investigators in 1911, though we can never know with certainty. What we do know is that a bright, innocent child lost her life in the most brutal fashion imaginable, while her killer, whether Albert Hampton or someone else entirely, escaped justice and disappeared into history. The failure of the system to protect Amy or to punish her murderer represents a tragic chapter in the long struggle between good and evil, justice and impunity, truth, and mystery. The impact of Amy's death rippled far beyond the small village of Long Cross, contributing to significant changes in how society approaches criminal investigation, child protection, and community safety. Her legacy lives on in the improved methods and procedures that might prevent future tragedies and ensure that other families do not suffer the same devastating loss of a child to senseless violence. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case is the realization that somewhere in the peaceful English countryside of 1911, a killer walked free, having successfully evaded justice for one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Whether Albert Hampton was guilty, as many suspected, or whether the real murderer remained hidden among the community, the truth died with those who possessed it, leaving only speculation and eternal mystery. The case of Amy Margaret Reeves stands as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, that innocence provides no protection against those who would do harm, and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, justice remains forever beyond our reach. Her story challenges us to remain vigilant, to protect the vulnerable, and to never forget that the price of safety is eternal watchfulness against those who would prey upon the innocent. In the end, Amy Reeves deserves to be remembered not just as a victim of unsolved crime, but as a symbol of all the children who have suffered at the hands of those who should have protected them, and as a reminder that every unsolved case represents not just a failure of the system, but a life cut short, a family destroyed, and a community forever changed by the presence of evil in their midst.